Well, I guess I'll start by talking to you guys. So, um, you guys have obviously been studying these three pieces, the Mozart Hunt and Haydn Sunrise and Beethoven 18/6 for the past couple of weeks. So, what have you guys like learned? Do you have any favorites? Do you have any any things that you learned about the pieces that you didn't know before? Anything that was really interesting that stood out to you these past couple of weeks? Did you like the pieces? That's good. Didn't hate them. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So, today I'm gonna be talking to you guys about the finales to all of each of these three quartets. So I know you guys have sort of gone through the rest of the quartets already, or the rest of the movements of the quartets. So today we're gonna do some listening to the finales and kind of talk through some of them, because there are some really cool and really interesting aspects to all three of these pieces. So first, I want to kind of just go over sort of the lineage and the influence each of these composers had on each other. I'm sure you guys have already learned about how Mozart and Haydn were very close friends, and they were deeply influenced by each other and each other's music. And Mozart actually wrote the Hunt Quartet in a set of 6 string quartets dedicated to Haydn. And he and Haydn had a really wonderful friendship. And I want to read you this quote that Haydn read about Mozart, because I think it's just such a nice example of how much these two composers really respected each other, especially Haydn sort of being known as the father of the string quartet, having so much respect for Mozart and what he did for the genre of the string quartet. So Haydn said, quote, "If I could only impress on the soul of every friend of music, and on high personages in particular, how inimitable are Mozart's works, how profound, how musically intelligent, how extraordinarily sensitive, for this is how I understand them, how I feel them. Why then the nations would vie with each other to possess such a jewel within their frontiers, but should reward him too, for without this, the history of great geniuses is sad indeed, and gives but little encouragement to posterity to future exertions. It enrages me to think that this incomparable Mozart is not yet engaged in some imperial or royal court. Forgive me if I lose my head, but I love this man so dearly." So as you can see, Mozart and Haydn really just had so much respect for each other. And Mozart, in dedicating these 6 quartets to Haydn, this was really his sort of, homage to Haydn as the inventor of the string quartet and inventor of this sort of form that we know today. So that really just can't be stressed enough, sort of the brilliance of Haydn in developing this form that we still play today. And then the way that Mozart and then Beethoven kind of picked up and ran with it. So the Mozart Hunt Quartet was actually written before the Sunrise Quartet, I'm sure you guys know. So Mozart wrote his Hunt Quartet in 1784. And it's just a really this last movement is super joyful, really operatic. There are no hard edges in it. It's just very, very fun, very exuberant, and very loving. So I thought we would start by listening to a recording of it. Let me see if I can share my screen. All right. Are you guys able to see this? I can't see you. So if you can see it, go ahead and unmute and say yes.
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 Cool. Thanks, guys. Awesome. So we're just going to listen to this last movement of Mozart's Hunt Quartet. It's just really, really beautiful. And I really want you guys to listen to sort of a lot of the operatic aspects of it. And we'll have a discussion about those particular aspects sort of after we hear it. So here's Mozart's Hunt Quartet played by the Alban Berg Quartet. All right. Do you guys have any thoughts about that? How did it sound operatic? What were some of the operatic elements that you could pick out of this finale? Did it sound operatic? If it didn't, that's also fine. What do you guys think? Philip, what did you think? I'm picking on you because you're my student.
I didn't really think it sounded that operatic. I kind of just thought that it was like a bow tie for the rest of the quartet. It was like the finishing piece and made it sound like the rest of it was all complete.
I love that. I think that's really great. And I think that's also exactly what Mozart was intending. I think when we think operatic, sometimes it's easy to think sort of the like slow, really lyrical singing stuff. But like you said, it can be kind of like a bow tie. Like, this is like the finale. And a lot of times the finales of like Mozart operas, for example, would just have everybody on stage and it's kind of like a big like party sort of way to like send off the rest of the course, the um rest of the opera, tie everything together. So I love that. Yeah. And a lot of the singing elements that we do find in there are sort of like little virtuosic things. Like you could probably hear a lot of big intervallic leaps, especially in the first violin part. And that would have been a very like operatic thing to do, very virtuosic. If you were a singer, having to sing like a big tenth or something like that. And then the way that the rest of the strings were usually accompanying the first violin or whoever has the melody at any given time. There's also a lot of like really fast character changes, a lot of little quick turns of the corner, which are definitely characteristic of Mozart operas in particular. So yeah, it is really operatic, not necessarily in the ways that we would normally think of something being operatic, but yeah, really good. I love that description of the bow tie. So we've talked a little bit about how Haydn sort of invented this string quartet form as we know it today. And as you guys know, a string quartet, usually there's four movements. And usually the first movement's kind of fast. There's two inner movements. One is like a slow lyrical movement. One of them is usually a dance. And then the last movement is usually a finale. So something that Haydn also kind of popularized doing in his string quartets and in his symphonies is writing a slow introduction before the first movement. So that became something that was like kind of standard to do in some places. And Mozart actually wrote maybe one of the most famous slow introductions of all time to a quartet, which is in the same set of quartets as the Hunt quartet that we just heard. So this quartet is really, really different. The nickname of this quartet is the Dissonance Quartet. And it's nicknamed that because of this slow introduction. It's really bizarre. If you haven't heard it before, it's really strange. It doesn't really sound like Mozart at all. So I'm gonna play just the opening of that for you guys too. I'm gonna share my screen again and play that for you. All right, so here is the introduction to Mozart's Dissonance Quartet. All right. So, um, yeah, what did you guys think? Was that really jarring to you? Was it really strange? Yeah.
Oh
So,
yeah. Oh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, do you
I
have
was just
comments
gonna
about it?
say, I honestly love this opening a lot. I played the first movement of this with my quartet, and I just love it. I think it's really just interesting, and I feel like the rest of the movement, if you, it kind of does sound like Mozart, but this part really doesn't, and it's kind of like a surprise because then it's like dun 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 dun, and it's like I don't know, it's like playful, but then in the beginning it's like really serious. So I like how he changes moods like so suddenly like that.
Yeah, I agree. And you're exactly right when you say, like, for those of you who haven't heard the rest of the movement, you should definitely take a listen to it. It's just like it's like pure Mozart. It's just like the last movement of the Hunt Quartet that we heard, and you would not know that this weird opening had even happened at all. It's like it happened, and then we just sort of like forget about it, you know. But this opening is really strange. It sounds strange to us. Imagine how strange it sounded in Mozart's day. Like those audiences must have just like been so shocked, you know. It was super avant-garde at the time, and it's still pretty avant-garde. So that's kind of Mozart putting his own twist on Haydn's slow introductions. So Haydn doesn't have any that quite sound quite that strange, and then Mozart kind of takes it one step further. So with this whole, you know, lineage of these three composers really influencing each other, Beethoven really then takes that concept of a slow introduction even one step further. So in his Opus 18 number 6 quartet, he actually sort of puts in this slow introduction that's almost like a standalone movement. He titles it La Malinconia, which is like melancholy, and he instructs in Italian at the top that it be played with the greatest delicacy. And it's a really kind of strange thing to have in the middle of what is otherwise a pretty joyful piece. I mean, you guys have now worked through the first three movements of it these past couple of weeks. So you've heard the first movement is so much fun, and the second movement is very beautiful and like loving, and then the third movement is like, you know, a really like raucous kind of scherzo, and then now we come to this, and it's really really shocking, and nobody really put a slow introduction before a finale movement before. And then Beethoven even takes it one step further than that. So as you heard in the dissonance, we have this slow introduction, and then the rest of the movement, it's like it never happens. Beethoven doesn't do that. So he puts in this slow introduction, and then it comes back and actually interrupts the rest of the movement later on in the movement. So it's really interesting how it becomes sort of this battle between the melancholy music and the really fun finale music. So I'm going to play you guys now that the finale movement from Opus 18 number 6, and listen for those moments when the melancholia creeps back in and kind of how shocking it is. So we'll take a listen to that. All right. So what did you guys think of that? Did you hear all of the times when the Melancholia came back and kind of permeated the movement? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think people can kind of interpret this movement in a lot of different ways. So some people sort of like view this movement as like it's generally a really happy movement, and then it just has some of, you know, the sadness from the melancholia kind of creep in a little bit, but it ends happy. It's like really joyful, it's really fun. And then some people kind of like view it a little bit darker, where like maybe the presto material, the fast stuff is kind of like trying to forget the sad stuff, but the sad stuff always kind of comes back to get you. And then at the very end, when it like goes really, really fast, it's like Beethoven trying to like get away from it, just like kind of close the book in a way. So it's kind of interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? What do you think about those two ideas?
Um, for me personally, I think maybe the second idea would fit more because it starts off with the sad thing, like the slow stuff, and it goes on
Mhm.
for a while. Like it makes you think like, oh, really, this is the finale? Like this doesn't seem like it. And then it goes happy, but even and then it goes back to sad and the happy. There's like a little bit of fast part when it was the second slow thing in the middle, but it didn't last. And
Mhm.
finally at the end, it got happy again, but um I don't know. I feel like the second one might go more with the music personally.
Yeah, it feels a little uncomfortable when it like transitions back to the happy after it's been the sadness kind of creeps in, right? Like you're kind of like, is it, are we really done with this? Or like, you know, it's kind of like just like pretending to move on. Yeah, interesting. Anybody else have thoughts? Do you agree, disagree? Yeah, I mean the cool thing is also there's no really right answer. I mean, we can't know what Beethoven was thinking when he was writing it. We do know some historians kind of point back to this time in his life, and he was starting to lose his hearing at that point. So a lot of people kind of look at, especially the first chunk of the finale, like the Melancholia, when it goes really loud and then really, really soft. A lot of scholars kind of think maybe that was like Beethoven kind of working through how he was like, you know, he would hear some things and then some things he couldn't hear, and was like kind of slowly losing his hearing. And he was definitely terrified of losing his hearing. So kind of interesting to think about if that's showing up in his music, or maybe he was really just taking this four movement string quartet form that Haydn and Mozart had done before him and really transforming it into something totally new. So it's really crazy to think that this piece was only written like 2 or 3 years after Haydn wrote the Sunrise Quartet, which sounds completely different, of course. And then you know, a lot of historians kind of look at this particular piece and this movement in particular as being sort of one of the sort of beginnings of the late Beethoven period, like sort of a preview into what was to come for Beethoven in his compositional life. Certainly he would like take this four movement string quartet form and then add a bunch of movements, you know, like some of his later quartets had 5, 6 movements. And he also would add slow introductions to things. Like a lot of people compare this movement to the finale movement of Beethoven's very last string quartet, which is Opus 135, where he wrote right at the end of his life. It was written more than 20 years after Opus 18, number 6. And it sounds very similar in that regard. So I'm just going to play you guys the intro to that one too. It's not very long, but it's really like interesting to hear how even like 20 years later in Beethoven's life, you know, he's doing something that he had experimented with doing way back early on in his string quartet writing. So that's just the slow introduction to Opus 135. But can you guys hear the similarities to the Melancholia? It's just like a lot of it is really a lot of the same, like the drama and the, suddenly very loud outbursts, and then the sort of like very soft kind of crying sections as well. And then Beethoven does the same thing in Opus 135 once the finale movement really starts. It starts very joyfully. It's, really happy, really fun. It's in major. And then he brings back aspects of the slow introduction later on in that movement also. Just kind of being like, it's not over. Like, he wrote it and then it keeps coming back over and over. So that's a really sort of interesting and important aspect in Beethoven's music. And it really starts in the Opus 18s. This idea where, Beethoven writes this introduction or writes a motive and it keeps coming back over and over all throughout the whole work. So I think Opus 18 number 6 is full of that. Beethoven's middle quartets then start to get really, really motivic in that way. You guys have probably heard of that, like in his symphonies too, like Beethoven 5, right? Everything is built on that little motive. So it becomes a really important aspect of Beethoven's music. So yeah, like I said, this Opus 18 number 6 was not written that long after Haydn's Sunrise Quartet. And there are definitely a lot of similarities in those two finales as well. Haydn doesn't do anything weird like with a slow introduction or play with the character too much. But he does do something kind of fun, which Beethoven ended up taking from Haydn, which is in the coda of the finale, he actually has you play the material faster. If you guys heard at the end of Opus 18 number 6, how it just went like presto right to the end, Haydn does that too, and it's like very, very fun and exciting. So I'm going to play for you guys the finale movement of the Sunrise Quartet. And while you're listening, I want you guys to remember the Mozart Hunt finale and the finale to 18/6, and think of some ways that all three of these pieces tie together and ways that they're similar, and also ways that they're different, and ways that each of these three composers are really putting their own mark on the finale of a string quartet movement. So here is the finale to Haydn Sunrise Quartet. All right. What did you guys think of that one? Any thoughts about similarities between the three finales? Thoughts about this finale and sort of some of the techniques Haydn was using in it?
I feel like this and The Hunt, they were more like op like kind of like operatic almost. Even though it's not like, like an opera, but it's like I feel like there's like a lot of voices even though there's only four, but even though it doesn't have any like slow like really slow parts, it's still like even the beginning, even though it doesn't start slow, it's definitely slower than the end. I feel like it gets even more chaotic as you go on, and it kind of
Mhm.
makes like that grand finale kind of feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And like part of what you're hearing too is the Mozart and Haydn are very sort of like homophonic writing. So like Haydn, especially if you look at the score for this movement, it's like a lot of the voices are kind of doing the same stuff. It looks kind of like a chorale in that sense. So everybody is sort of part of a chord, and it's very chordal writing. And it sounds really singing. It sounds really good natured. There's not too many like super sharp edges. And the Mozart is like that too. Like the textures are really distinct. There's usually like kind of a melody, and then the accompanimental voices are sort of creating this you know, I guess like kind of carpet for the melody to ride on. So those are definitely huge aspects of Haydn and Mozart. Just those styles of writing. Yeah, that's a great observation. Anybody else?
I like how listening to the final movements, you can sort of hear remnants like from the first movement, like sort of how they remixed it, I guess, to close it out.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's true sort of throughout all three of these pieces. I think, Haydn sort of started this, sort of idea of having sort of a theme right from the very beginning and kind of carrying it through the work. And Mozart took that in his own way, and then Beethoven really took that and started running with it later on in his quartets. For sure, you can hear elements of the earlier movements all throughout. Yeah, really great. Anybody else? Does anyone have a favorite?
Mine was the Beethoven one.
The Beethoven one? Why was that your
Really like
favorite?
the presto ending.
Yeah, it's
I
really
like
fun, right? I mean,
slumbering and trying to frenzy. I don't really know.
yeah, it's also really hard for the first violin right there. That's a very scary moment, as you can imagine. Yeah, hearing someone play it like super virtuosically and super well is really, really exciting. I also love the end of that Beethoven. I think no matter which sort of way you're looking at it, if you think it's really, really joyful and fun, or if you think it's a little bit kind of trying to get away from the stuff before it, either way, it's really exciting ending. Yeah, awesome. Anybody else have a favorite? It's hard to pick because they're very similar in a lot of ways. We mentioned sort of having like the motivic saturation that continues all through the works. And all of these composers lived sort of around the same time, and they were all influenced by each other. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. Beethoven actually waited kind of a long time before he started writing string quartets. I mean, these are opus 18. So he wanted to make sure that he had really studied quartet writing, and Haydn in particular as sort of like the father of the string quartet, before he really started delving into this genre. And then some people think that Haydn studied the score of Beethoven's Opus 18 quartets as he was writing his Opus 77 quartets, which is really cool to think about, you know, Beethoven having such respect and reverence for Haydn and his writing, and then Haydn kind of turning it around and studying Beethoven's writing also. So all these composers knew each other and were really influenced by each other. And you can hear it. You can definitely hear it in the music. What do you think might be some like challenges of playing each of these finales? Obviously, we talked about sort of the virtuosity in especially the first violin part in Opus 18 number 6. But what do you guys think might be some of the other challenges we might face? Or maybe you guys wouldn't have any challenges. You're all too good. So it's, yeah, go ahead, Paige.
I feel like
Sorry,
the
go ahead.
rhythms would be challenging since they sort of play off of each other a lot, and then sometimes they're together.
Yeah, I think especially in the Beethoven, right? There's a lot of like kind of rhythmic interplay. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The rhythms can be really challenging, especially I think the Haydn is kind of, you know, a little bit simpler in that way. And then kind of Beethoven takes it and makes it definitely more challenging with like the meter and with sort of playing with different characters and things. So kind of like, I just kind of want to go through each one and kind of talk about them in a little bit more detail with the little time we have left, because it can be kind of easy to hear them all, especially they're all in the same key. They were all written kind of around the same time, so it can be easy to sort of like hear them all as being somewhat the same, but there are some distinct characteristics of all three of these that make them different and make them challenging in their own ways. So Haydn obviously really invented this genre. And this is like playing Haydn is sort of like bread and butter of playing string quartet repertoire. So Haydn really sort of teaches us all of the basic quartet playing skills that we need. So it teaches us, you know, how to play really well in tune, because as we were talking about in that finale, everything is really chordal. So everything is just like kind of built on these chords. And so if you were to play that finale really slow, it would sound kind of like a Bach chorale. And that makes it really tricky for intonation. So Haydn just kind of like playing everything really well in tune, playing everything really unified. So since everybody is playing a lot of the same stuff, we have to be really specific about the articulations that we're using, and about the dynamic and the phrasing scheme that we want. And also, if you guys take a look at some of these Haydn parts, there are like no dynamics written in. Have you guys ever noticed that? Yeah, it can be tricky. Like sometimes there's a forte, sometimes there's a piano. But aside from that, he doesn't really give a lot of instruction, mostly because at the time when he was writing it, people would mostly sort of know what the style was and know what to do. And also like Haydn was playing some of these, so he was alive and he could tell people how he wanted them to be played. But for us, it leaves sort of a lot up to interpretation. So we can look at the score and we can kind of wonder what Haydn would have wanted, and in the end, kind of make up our own phrasing scheme, our own dynamic scheme. So it really requires a lot of like creativity on the part of the performer, because we just don't have that much information. So that can be a lot of fun, and it can also be kind of scary to look at and interpret. Mozart is kind of similar in that way. There's not a whole lot of like dynamics or instruction written in. You'll probably notice the same thing if you look at a Mozart score as the Haydn score. Like sometimes there's a forte, sometimes there's a mezzo forte when he wants to get like really crazy. Sometimes there's pianissimos, which is always an indicator of a really, really special color. But for the most part, it's kind of a blank canvas. And with Mozart, it's a little bit easier because we can refer to a lot of his opera writing. And a lot of this stuff should be played as it would be sung. The fast stuff, obviously, is more virtuosic and less singing, but to try and find the phrasing that Mozart would have been going for, or you know, the emphasis and the articulation, we will look a lot to vocal performance of Mozart's operas. And then aside from that, Mozart is just can be really finicky with articulation. So it's sort of like everything, there's a lot of like really little details that can really make Mozart boring or make it really interesting. Have you guys ever noticed that? Like, have you ever been to a performance of Mozart where you thought it was just really, really boring? It's totally fine if you have. I have, definitely. And the difference between a really boring performance of Mozart and a really amazing performance of Mozart is this attention to detail. So talking a lot about articulation and a lot about phrasing, and a lot about the way that these gestures should be, can really make a big difference between kind of, this is Mozart and it's boring, and this is Mozart and it's like incredible. So that's sort of the trick with Mozart, is really bringing it to life in that way. Beethoven, as we talked about, is pretty virtuosic, right? And this sort of turning point of the century, this was published in 1801. And this turning point of the century also was around the time when stringed instruments were changing a little bit. So have you guys ever played on like a Baroque instrument? Like where they had like gut strings and the cellos didn't have end pins and stuff like that. Have you seen them, those instruments? Yeah, so those like period instruments are what they would have been playing on in Haydn's time and Mozart's time, and to some extent Beethoven's time as well. This sort of marks the turning point when instruments really started changing a little bit. So started doing away with gut strings. End pins were added for the cello, which meant that the cello could be a more virtuosic instrument instead of an accompanimental instrument. So that's why the writing for all four parts in the Beethoven Opus 18 number 6 start to become a lot more complicated and a lot more virtuosic. And as you move into Beethoven's like middle quartets, the Opus 59s, that stuff is all over the place. Like it's really hard for all the instruments. So Beethoven starts just getting more technically challenging to play. Players start getting better, but even Beethoven's writing, I think, was too virtuosic even for what people could play at the time. A lot of people just physically like couldn't play the stuff that he was writing, which is pretty crazy. So we're really lucky today that we have modern instruments with modern capabilities. They certainly didn't have that in Beethoven's time. Also, in the Beethoven, of course, we talked about there's a lot of really fast changing moods and fast changing characters. Obviously, there's the melancholia, and then it keeps coming back. So as a performer, being able to sort of switch modes on and off really quickly is really crucial and really hard to do. But those fast mood changes are really what starts to set Beethoven apart. And he starts to develop that much more as he composes much more. So articulations start to change. He becomes a little more specific than Haydn and Mozart were about writing exactly the type of articulation that he wanted. If he wanted an accent or if he wanted a sforzando, those would be two different things. And he just gets a little more specific because he wants a different sound. And you see that more and more in Beethoven's music as it starts to develop. So yeah, those are sort of like the big kind of challenges with each of those works that we have found in working on them. And they're certainly all amazing, and the challenges are really rewarding to work on because the pieces are so incredible. Do you guys have any questions or thoughts about any of the pieces that we listened to today, or anything that I said, anything that we covered? Cool. Awesome. Well, if you guys do have any questions or want to know more about any of those recordings, you can feel free to send us a message at our email, or we're on Instagram and Facebook. So cool. Thank you guys for coming on this Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven journey with us over these past couple of weeks. I hope it's been fun for you guys. It's really fun for us to kind of be able to compare and contrast these three really amazing works. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.